3 months after the rescue, Jihei stood in the grand area on the Karathi homeworld and tried to remember how to breathe. The structure rose around her in sweeping curves of polished stone and living wood. A cathedral built for creatures who could fly, with platforms at dozens of levels where thousands of Karathi had gathered to witness what was about to happen. Sunlight streamed through crystal panels in the ceiling, painting the air with colors that human eyes could barely perceive. She wore formal clothing that the Karathi had made especially for her, a flowing garment in deep blue that matched the color of Chirath's feathers. Her wounds had healed as much as they were going to heal, leaving scars that ached when the weather changed and a stiffness in her shoulder that would never fully fade. But she was alive, and she was standing here, and that was more than she had expected during those dark moments in the maintenance shaft. Elder Velith approached her on the central platform, his ancient frame draped in ceremonial robes that shimmered with each movement. Behind him walked 12 children in their finest plumage, their feathers groomed to perfection and their eyes bright with excitement. Chirath carried a crown woven from feathers that had been donated by thousands of Karathi across their civilization, each one representing a family that wished to honor the human who had saved their young. Yoon Ji-hye, Elder Velith announced, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the vast space. You stand before the gathered clans of the Karathi people to receive a title that has never been granted to an outsider in our 12,000 years of recorded history. The crowd fell silent. The title of Velith Korra, Guardian of Nests, is our highest honor, the administrator continued. It is reserved for those who have protected Karathi young at the cost of their own safety, at the risk of their own lives, without thought of reward or recognition. He turned to face the assembly. 3 months ago, this human entered a dying section of orbital station Velith 9 when none of our people could survive the journey. She climbed through darkness and pain and fear, carrying 12 of our children to safety. She did not know if she would live or die. She only knew that young ones needed help, and she could provide it. Elder Velith's voice cracked with emotion. I was there. I told her not to go. I let my prejudice blind me to her courage, and she went anyway. She saved those children despite my doubt, despite generations of fear between our peoples, despite everything we had taught her about her place in our world. He turned back to Jihei. Today we begin to right those wrongs. Today we welcome you not as an outsider or a worker or a tolerated presence, but as one of our own. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Jihei had experienced. Karathi priests spoke ancient words in a language that predated space travel, and musicians played instruments that created sounds Jihei felt more than heard. She was anointed with oils that smelled of flowers from a world she had never visited, and symbols were painted on her forehead in pigments that would fade over time but whose meaning would remain forever. Then Chara stepped forward carrying the crown of woven feathers. This crown was made by the families of those you saved, the child said in clear common so that Jihei would understand, and by families of children you have never met, who want you to know that they are grateful. Every feather is a promise that you will always have a home among us. Jihei knelt so that Charath could reach her head. The crown was lighter than she expected, a whisper of color and warmth that settled onto her hair like a blessing when she rose. The entire assembly burst into song. Thousands of voices lifted in harmony, singing words that Jihei did not understand but whose meaning was perfectly clear. Welcome, welcome, welcome home. After the ceremony, Elder Velith explained what the title truly meant. You are now a protected member of Karathi society, he told her in a private chamber while the celebration continued outside. Any harm done to you will be treated as harm done to a child. You will have access to our homeworld, our councils, our sacred spaces. Doors that have been closed to outsiders for millennia will open for you. He paused and something softened in his ancient eyes. But more than that, The children you saved will be considered your flock. In our culture, this creates a bond that transcends species. You will be part of 12 families, welcomed into their homes and their celebrations and their lives. You will never be alone again. Jihei struggled to find words. I did not do this for reward. She finally managed. I did it because children were dying, and I could help. We know, Elder Velith replied. That is exactly why you deserve this reward. You acted without thought of yourself. You gave everything to save strangers who had been taught to fear you. That kind of selflessness cannot go unrecognized. He placed a taloned hand on her shoulder, gentle despite the sharp points of his fingers. There is more. Our government has been watching this situation closely. They have seen how you treated our children with kindness long before the crisis. The origami figures, the patient distance you maintained, even when it must have been lonely. They see in you a bridge between our peoples. What does that mean? Jihei asked. It means we want to open formal relations with Earth, Elder Velith said. Real relations, not the careful distance we have maintained until now. Trade and cultural exchange, and perhaps someday true alliance. But we will only negotiate with someone we trust. He met her eyes with a gaze that held 12,000 years of caution, finally giving way to hope. We want you to speak for humanity. Jihei, not because you are a diplomat or a politician, but because you showed us what humans can be at their best. You are the bridge we need. 6 months later, Jihei sat in a garden on the Karathi homeworld and watched the sun set through leaves of silver and gold chereth, and several of the other children played nearby, chasing each other through the flower beds with shrieks of laughter that sounded like music. They no longer flinched when she moved quickly or looked at her with fear in their eyes. To them, she was simply Jihei, the human who made paper birds and told stories about a planet called Earth where the water fell from the sky and creatures without feathers walked upright. Transport vessel descended from the clouds and settled onto the landing pad at the edge of the garden. Human diplomats emerged, men and women in formal clothing who looked around at the alien landscape with wonder and nervousness. They had come to begin the negotiations that would shape the relationship between their species for generations to come. One of them spotted Jihei sitting in the grass surrounded by Karathi children and approached with careful steps. Ms. Yoon, the diplomat said, bowing slightly. We've been looking forward to meeting you. The Karathi speak very highly of your judgment. Jihei rose and dusted pollen from her clothes. Please call me Jihei, she said. I am happy to help however I can. Chirith came running over and took Jihei's hand, looking up at the human visitors with curious eyes. Are these your flock? The child asked, and Jihei smiled and squeezed the small taloned hand in her own. In a way, she said. They are my people, just like you are my people now. The diplomat looked confused, but Jihei did not bother to explain. Some things could not be translated into words. They could only be understood through small acts of kindness repeated over time, through paper cranes left on windowsills and songs sung in darkness, and a climb through broken corridors that seemed to go on forever. They could only be understood through love. Jihei led the diplomats toward the meeting hall, Chirith still holding her hand behind her. The children of her flock resumed their play, their laughter echoing across the garden like bells above them all. The alien stars began to appear in the darkening sky, watching over a future that had been built one act of courage at a time. The bridge between worlds was open, and it had started with 12 children and 1 human who refused to let them die alone. Jihei drifted in a sea of darkness for what felt like centuries. Sometimes she rose toward the surface and caught fragments of sound, voices speaking in languages she could not understand, beeping machines and rushing footsteps, and somewhere far away, the sound of children calling her name. Then she would sink again into the black water of unconsciousness. and the world would disappear. She woke for the first time on the 5th day after the rescue. Her eyes opened to find herself in a medical bay filled with soft blue light and equipment she did not recognize. Tubes ran into her arms and monitors displayed information in Karathi script that meant nothing to her. Every part of her body ached with a deep, persistent pain that seemed to have settled into her bones. A Karathi physician noticed her awakening and hurried to her bedside. The doctor was young by their species standards, with iridescent green feathers and a nervous energy that reminded Jihei of a hummingbird. "You are awake," the physician said in accented common. "Please do not move. Your injuries are severe. We are doing everything we can." "The children," Jihei whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. "All 12 survived," the physician assured her quickly. "They are healthy and safe because of you. Now please rest." Jihei closed her eyes and let the relief wash over her like warm water. The children had survived. Whatever happened to her now? At least she had accomplished that much. She drifted back into sleep with a small smile on her cracked lips. The days that followed were a blur of treatments and assessments. Karathi medical team had little experience with human physiology, and they worked from databases and remote consultations with human doctors who were weeks away by fastest transport. They set her broken ribs with materials designed for their own fragile bones and had to improvise when her dense human skeleton rejected their standard treatments. They stitched the wound in her shoulder using techniques they learned from veterinary texts, and they pumped her full of medications that they hoped would work on her alien biochemistry. Elder Velith visited her on the 8th day. Jihai was propped up in her bed when the administrator entered. Her body still weak, but her mind finally clear enough for conversation. She watched the ancient Karathi approach with slow, careful steps, and she saw something in his faded eyes that had not been there before. "The story of what you did has spread," Elder Velith said, settling into a chair beside her bed. "Every Karathi in this sector knows your name, Yoon Jihei. They know what you sacrificed for children who were taught to fear you." Jihei shook her head slightly. "I did what anyone would do. They were children. They needed help. That is all." "That is not all," the administrator replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I have lived for many years. I have seen much of this galaxy and its peoples. I have held prejudice in my heart against your species since before you were born. I believed humans were dangerous, unpredictable, too brutal to be trusted near our young." He paused and looked down at his taloned hands. "I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong, and my blindness nearly cost 12 children their lives. If you had listened to me, if you had obeyed my orders to stay away from them, they would be dead now." "Elder," Jihei began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish, please. This is difficult for me. I need to say these words." He met her eyes with a gaze that held centuries of regret. "I asked you not to go. I told you that your presence would only traumatize them in their final moments. Do you remember that I was more concerned with my prejudice than with their lives? What kind of guardian does that make me? A scared one," Jihei said softly. "You were trying to protect them the only way you knew how. You could not have known that I would succeed." Elder Velith's feathers rippled. "But you did know. You believed in yourself when no one else did. You went into that broken place and brought them out alive. And you nearly died doing it." He reached into his robes and pulled out a small object that glinted in the soft light. It was the paper crane, the one Chirith had pressed into her hand before she collapsed. Someone had cleaned the blood from its folds and smoothed its creases, and looked almost new again. "The children wanted you to have this back," Elder Velith said, placing the crane on her bedside table. "They have been asking about you every day. They want to see you, to thank you properly." Jihei felt tears prick at her eyes. "I would like that." The administrator nodded and rose to leave. then paused at the door. "What you did has changed things," he said, without turning around. "Not just for me, but for my people. We are having conversations about humans that we have never had before. Questions are being asked about how we treat your kind, about whether our fear has blinded us to your worth." He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You may have saved more than 12 lives. Yoon-jae, you may have built a bridge that will stand for generations. Rest now. There will be much to discuss when you are stronger." He left, and Ji-hae stared at the paper crane on her table. She had not thought about bridges or generations or changing minds when she entered that damaged corridor. She had only thought about children who needed help and a body that could provide it, but perhaps that was how bridges were built. Not through grand plans or political negotiations, but through simple acts of reaching out when reaching out seemed impossible. The children came to visit her on the 12th day. All 12 of them filed into her medical bay in a careful line, their small faces solemn with the gravity of the occasion. They had brought gifts, small objects they had made or collected, and they placed them around her bed like offerings at a shrine, a woven bracelet of shed feathers in 12 different colors. A drawing of a human figure surrounded by small birds, clearly meant to represent Ji-hae and her tiny passengers. A stone that one child explained came from the garden on their homeworld, carried all the way to the station because it was lucky, and more paper cranes, dozens of them in every size and color, folded with varying degrees of skill by hands that were still learning. The children had taught themselves. Argamichereth came forward last, still clutching the original crane that Ji-hae had made weeks ago. "We practiced," the pale blue child said in careful comment. "We wanted to make them like you do, so you would know we remember." Ji-hae looked at the paper birds scattered across her bed and felt something break open in her chest. "They are beautiful," she managed to say through the tears that were streaming down her face. "They are the most beautiful cranes I have ever seen." The children gathered around her bed and began to sing it. It was the same song they had sung in the maintenance shaft, the song of courage that had carried her through the darkness, but this time they sang it slowly, gently, with harmonies that seemed to wrap around her like a warm blanket. Ji-hae listened with her eyes closed and let the music wash away her pain. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if she would ever fully heal or what her place in this corner of the galaxy might become, but she knew that she had found something rare and precious in this strange place. She had found family in the most unexpected form. 12 small voices singing her home. Ji-hae worked quickly despite the pain that radiated through her chest. With every breath she tied the emergency blankets together to create a makeshift harness, testing each knot with desperate fingers that had gone numb from the cold. The 12 children watched her with a mixture of fear and hope, their small bodies pressed close together for warmth as the temperature in the nursery continued to drop. "I need you to climb onto me," Ji-hae said, using simple words and gestures to communicate across the language barrier. "Hold tight and do not let go. I will carry you out." Chirith translated for the others in rapid chirping Karathi, and slowly the children began to approach. They were so light Ji-hae had known intellectually that Karathi had hollow bones and weighed far less than humans of similar size. But the reality still surprised her. Each child felt like holding a bundle of feathers in air. Fragile and precious beyond measure, she secured 4 children to her chest, 4 to her back, and 2 under each arm, using strips of blanket to tie them in place so her hands would remain free for climbing. The weight was manageable, perhaps 30 kilograms total for all 12 combined, but her injured ribs made even that modest burden feel like carrying a mountain. Only escape route she could identify was a maintenance shaft that ran vertically through the station toward the central core. The shaft was designed for service robots and emergency access. with handholds spaced at intervals meant for mechanical limbs rather than living hands. Gravity in this section had become unreliable, flickering between normal pull and weightlessness. As the station system's failure led her small charges out of the nursery and into the corridor beyond. The children clung to her body like tiny passengers on a ship sailing through a storm, their talons gripping the fabric of her uniform and their beaks pressed against her skin. She could feel their hearts beating rapidly against her chest. Small drums of terror that matched the rhythm of her own pounding pulse. She found the maintenance shaft access panel and pried it open with bleeding fingers. The shaft extended upward into darkness. A narrow tunnel that seemed to go on forever. Emergency lights flickered at irregular intervals, casting shadows that danced and twisted in ways that made Ji-Hai's damaged eyes ache. "Hold on," she told the children. "Do not let go no matter what happens." She began to climb. The first 50 meters were manageable despite the pain. She found a rhythm of reaching and pulling, her arms doing most of the work while her legs braced against the walls of the shaft for stability. The children were silent except for their rapid breathing, and she felt their small bodies trembling against her own gravity. Failed completely as she passed the 100-meter mark. Suddenly, she was floating in the shaft with 12 children strapped to her body, and the disorientation nearly made her vomit inside her oxygen mask. She grabbed the handhold and anchored herself, waiting for the spinning sensation to pass. One of the children began to cry, a soft keening sound that broke her heart. "It is okay," Ji-Hai whispered, though she did not know if they could understand her. "We are okay. Keep holding on." She resumed climbing in zero gravity, pulling herself hand over hand through the darkness while the children rode her like a living vessel. The weightlessness made their mass irrelevant, but it also made every movement unpredictable. She had to fight to keep herself oriented, to maintain her grip on the handholds, to avoid spinning out of control in the endless black tunnel. Another debris impact struck the station somewhere nearby. The shaft shook violently, and a piece of metal torn from the wall came spinning toward her. Fachi twisted to shield the children with her body, and the shrapnel sliced across her shoulder. Instead of hitting the small ones behind her, blood began to flow from the wound, droplets floating away in the zero gravity like tiny red jewels. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot lance that made her vision blur and her grip weaken. She felt herself starting to drift away from the handhold and forced her fingers to close tighter. She could not let go. She would not let go. The children needed her to keep climbing, and so she would keep climbing until her arms failed completely. Lyrith began to sing. The sound was soft at first, barely audible above the groaning of the damaged station. It was a song in Karathi, something with a gentle melody that rose and fell like waves on a shore. Ji-Hai had never seen. The other children joined in, their young voices blending together in a harmony that seemed to push back against the darkness. Ji-Hai did not understand the words, but she understood the intention. They were singing to give her courage, to remind her that she was not alone in this nightmare tunnel. These children who had been taught to fear her were now trying to comfort her. She felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with her cracked ribs. She climbed faster. The shaft branched at the 200-meter mark, and Ji-Hai had to make a choice without any information to guide her. She chose the branch that angled toward what she hoped was the station core, the most heavily reinforced section where survivors would be gathering. Gravity returned in stuttering bursts as she moved through the junction, pulling her downward and then releasing her in a pattern that made her stomach lurch. The children gripped her tighter and kept singing their song of courage. She emerged from the shaft into a corridor that still had power and atmosphere. The air was thin but breathable, and she tore off her oxygen mask to take deep, gasping breaths that sent fire through her broken ribs. The children looked around with wide eyes, recognizing that they had escaped the worst of the damage, but they were not safe Yet Jihai could hear the station's emergency announcements echoing through the corridor. Calling all survivors to evacuation points in the central hub, she began to walk, then to jog, then to run despite the agony that screamed through her body with every step. The children bounced against her as she moved, their small hands gripping tighter as she picked up speed. She burst through a set of double doors and found herself in the main evacuation area. Hundreds of Karethi adults turned to stare at her, and for a moment the entire space fell silent. She knew what they saw: a human covered in blood, her uniform torn and her face twisted with pain, carrying 12 of their precious children strapped to her body like cargo. She must have looked like a monster from their nightmares. Then someone screamed a name, and a crimson-feathered mother rushed forward with her arms outstretched. "Velith," the mother cried. "My Velith." Other parents followed, pushing through the crowd to reach their children. Jai stood still as hands carefully untied the blanket harness and lifted the young ones away from her body. She watched families reunite, parents clutching their children and weeping with relief, and she felt a strange emptiness settle over her. Now that her burden had been lifted, Charith was the last to be removed. The pale blue child looked up at Jihei with those curious eyes and pressed the worn paper crane into her hand. "Thank you," Charith said in careful comment. "Thank you for coming." Jihei tried to respond but found that she had no words. Her vision was growing dark at the edges, and her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She saw Elder Velith pushing through the crowd toward her, his ancient face showing an emotion she could not name. "You saved them," the administrator said, his voice cracking. "You came for them when we could not." Jihei opened her mouth to answer, but no sound emerged. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward into darkness, the paper crane still clutched in her bloody hand. The last thing she heard before consciousness fled was the sound of children singing, their voices lifted in the song they had sung during the climb. They were singing for her. They were singing her home. The station shook with the first impacts as Jihei reached the central command hub, where emergency coordinators were shouting orders in 3 different languages. Screens displayed the debris field as a cloud of red dots converging on their position, and each dot represented a fragment of twisted metal or frozen rock that could punch through the hull and kill everyone in its path. The Karathi moved with frantic efficiency, their hollow bones and light frames allowing them to dart through corridors at speeds Jihei could never match. But that same delicate construction made them vulnerable in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Evacuation priority is the young," a coordinator announced over the station-wide communication system. "All children will be loaded onto emergency shuttles first. Adults will shelter in reinforced sections until rescue vessels arrive." Jihei found herself assigned to a damage control team tasked with sealing breaches as they occurred. The work was brutal and terrifying. She ran from section to section with patches and sealant foam, plugging holes in the hull while the station groaned around her like a wounded animal. Debris continued to strike in random patterns, and each impact sent tremors through the floor that knocked lighter Karathi off their feet. An hour into the crisis, the eastern wing took a direct hit from a fragment the size of a ground transport vehicle. The shields deflected most of the energy, but the impact still tore a gash in the outer hull and triggered a cascade of structural failures throughout that section. Blast doors slammed shut as emergency protocols sealed off. The damaged Jihei heard the announcement through her communication device and felt her blood turn to ice. 12 children confirmed trapped in the eastern wing nursery, the coordinator reported. Atmosphere is venting through multiple microfractures. Estimated breathable air remaining is 40 minutes. She abandoned her current task and ran toward the eastern wing, pushing past Karathi adults who were gathered at the sealed blast doors in various states of panic and grief. Parents wailed in their musical language, Their feathers pressed flat against their bodies in distress. Teachers clutched each other and stared at the doors as if willpower alone could force them open. Elder Velith stood at the center of the chaos. His ancient face twisted with anguish as he spoke rapidly into a communication device. Jihei pushed her way to the front and grabbed the arm of a nearby technician. "Why is no one going in?" she demanded. "There must be another route." The technician stared at her with eyes full of despair. "The corridors are compromised. The pressure differentials would collapse our skeletal structures. Any adult Karathi who enters will die before reaching halfway." Jihei released the technician and turned to study the schematic displayed on a nearby screen. The eastern wing was a maze of damaged corridors and failing life support, with pressure zones that fluctuated wildly as atmosphere leaked from dozens of small breaches. For a Karathi with hollow bones, attempting passage would be suicide, but Jihei was not Karathi. Her skeleton was dense calcium and collagen, evolved on a high-gravity world where falls from trees could be survived and predators had to be fought with bare hands. Her muscles were thick and powerful compared to the avian species around her. Her lungs could function in oxygen levels that would render a Karathi unconscious. She could survive. "What they could not, I can reach them," she said, loudly enough for Elder Velith to hear. The administrator turned toward her with an expression she could not read. "You are human," he said, as if reminding her of something she might have forgotten. "That is why I can do this," Jihei replied. "Your people cannot survive the pressure changes. But I can. My bones will not break. My body can handle the stress. Let me go." Elder Velith's feathers rippled with conflicting emotions. She saw fear there, and doubt, and something that might have been hope struggling against a lifetime of prejudice. "The children," he said slowly, "they are already terrified. Your presence will only add to their trauma in their final moments." "Their final moments do not have to be final," Jihei snapped, her patience breaking under the weight of those words. "I can save them if you let me try." A high murmur ran through the crowd of Karathi parents. Some looked at her with desperate hope, while others recoiled at the thought of a predator approaching their trapped young one. Mother stepped forward, her plumage a deep crimson that reminded Jihei of autumn leaves. "Let the human go," the mother said, her voice cracking with grief. "My child is in there. If there is any chance at all, we must take it." Other parents joined her voice, their fear of humans overwhelmed by their greater fear of losing their children. Elder Velith closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. "Open the blast doors," he ordered. "Give the human access." Jihei did not wait for further permission. She grabbed a portable oxygen mask from an emergency station and secured it over her face, then collected a repair kit and a bundle of emergency blankets that she strapped across her back. The blast doors groaned open just wide enough for her to squeeze through before sealing shut behind her. The corridor beyond was a nightmare of twisted metal and flickering lights. Atmosphere hissed from cracks in the walls, and the floor beneath her feet tilted at an angle that made walking difficult. Jihei pushed forward, one hand braced against the wall for balance, her eyes scanning for the path that would lead her to the nursery. She had gone perhaps 50 meters when a secondary impact struck the station. Somewhere above her, the ceiling buckled and collapsed, filling the corridor behind her with debris that blocked any possibility of retreat. Jia stared at the wall of wreckage for 3 heartbeats, then turned and continued forward. There was no going back now. She would reach those children or she would die in the attempt. And either way, she would keep moving until her body refused to carry her any further. The pressure began to fluctuate as she moved deeper into the damaged section. She felt it in her ears first, a painful popping sensation that made her jaw ache. Then she felt it in her chest, a tightness that made each breath a conscious effort. Blood vessels burst in her eyes, painting her vision with red threads that blurred the edges of her sight. She ignored the pain and kept walking. A section of floor gave way beneath her, and she fell through into a lower corridor, landing hard on her shoulder with an impact that sent white-hot agony through her body. Something cracked in her ribcage. Maybe one rib or maybe two, and breathing became an exercise in controlled suffering. She climbed to her feet and found her bearings and continued toward the nursery. The temperature dropped as she moved through a section where the heating systems had failed completely. Her breath fogged in front of her face despite the oxygen mask, and frost began to form on the surfaces around her. She could see her hands shaking but could not feel them anymore. The nursery door appeared ahead of her, bent and warped but still intact. Jihei pressed her palm against the emergency release and felt nothing happen. The mechanism was damaged or frozen or simply dead. She stepped back and threw her shoulder against the door, once and twice and 3 times until the frame buckled and the door swung inward on broken hinges. 12 small faces turned toward her in the finder darkness. 12 sets of eyes went wide with terror. 12 voices rose in screams that cut through her heart like knives. She had come to save them, and they thought she had come to kill them. Jihei sank to her knees and held up her empty hands, trying to show that she meant no harm. The children huddled together in the far corner of the room, their small bodies pressed against each other in a mass of trembling feathers and frightened cries. One child stood slightly apart from the others, pale blue feathers tipped with silver catching the dim emergency light. Chirus stared at Jihei with recognition dawning in those curious eyes. The child reached into a pocket and pulled out a small paper crane, the same one Jihei had left on the bench weeks ago, now worn and creased from being carried everywhere. She is the one, Chirus said in a small, clear voice. She makes the paper birds. She will not hurt us. The screaming began to fade as the other children looked at the crane in Chirith's hands. They did not understand, but they trusted their friend. Jihei felt tears running down her face as she gestured toward the door behind her. We need to go, she said in her limited Karathi, hoping they could understand. I will carry you. I will keep you safe. But we need to go now. Charith walked forward and placed a tiny taloned hand in Jihai's palm. The other children followed, one by one, until all 12 surrounded her in a circle of trust that she had never expected to earn. The station shuddered again as more debris struck the outer hull. Time was running out. Jihei began to fashion a carrier from the emergency blankets, her cracked ribs screaming with every movement. She would get these children out or she would die trying. There was no other option she was willing to accept. The transport ship docked at orbital station Velith 9 with a gentle shudder, and Yoon Jihei gathered her single bag of belongings before stepping into the airlock. She had traveled for 3 weeks through empty space to reach this place, a massive educational facility that orbited a swirling gas giant the color of burnt orange and deep purple. This station housed over 2,000 Karathi, an avian species with hollow bones and feathers that shimmered in colors humans could barely perceive. Jihei was one of only 3 humans assigned to Velith 9 through the Galactic Labor Exchange Program, and as she walked through the arrival terminal, she felt every alien eye turn toward her with something between curiosity and disgust. The Karathi stood tall and slender, their bodies covered in plumage that rippled when they moved. They had large eyes positioned on the sides of their heads, giving them nearly complete peripheral vision, and their beaks clicked softly as they communicated in a language that sounded like wind chimes mixed with birdsong. Jihei knew she looked wrong to them. Her forward-facing eyes marked her as a predator in their instinctive understanding of the universe. Her dense bones and heavy footsteps made her seem clumsy and dangerous compared to their delicate frame. She tried to smile at the customs officer who processed her documents, But the Karathi flinched backward as if she had bared her teeth in threat. "Maintenance Section 7, the officer said in broken common, sliding a badge across the counter without meeting her gaze. "Lower decks, away from student areas. You understand this requirement?" "Yes." Jihei nodded and took the badge she understood perfectly. Karathi had requested human workers because their station needed repairs in sections where the pressure fluctuations and gravity anomalies made work dangerous. For their fragile bodies, humans could survive conditions that would shatter Karathi bones like glass, but that usefulness did not translate into acceptance or respect. She found her quarters in the belly of the station, a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out at the endless storms of the gas giant below. The other two humans on the station worked different shifts, and she rarely saw them except in passing. Her days fell into a rhythm of isolation and labor. She crawled through maintenance shafts and repaired air recyclers and replaced damaged conduits in sections where the temperature dropped low enough to frost her breath. The Karathi technicians who supervised her work kept their distance, communicating through tablets rather than speech, and they never thanked her when she finished a difficult job during her rounds. Jihei sometimes passed through corridors near the educational wings where young Karathi attended their lessons. She was forbidden from entering those areas, but she could see through the transparent walls into classrooms filled with children whose feathers had not yet developed their adult patterns. They were small and bright and full of energy, chasing each other through zero-gravity play areas and singing songs that echoed through the halls. The children feared her even more than the adults did when they spotted her walking past. They would freeze and stare with wide eyes before scattering like startled birds. Their teachers would gather them close and whisper reassurances while shooting angry looks in her direction, as if her mere presence had traumatized their students. Learned to walk different routes to avoid causing panic. One child did not. Ranjahai first noticed the small Karathi during her second week on the station. The child had pale blue feathers tipped with silver and eyes that held more curiosity than fear, while other young ones fled at the sight of the human. This one lingered at the edge of the corridor and watched Jihei work on a malfunctioning light panel. Jihei pretended not to notice, but she felt the weight of that gaze like a warm spot on the back of her neck. The child appeared again 2 days later, and then again after. Jihei learned through careful observation that the young Karathi was named Chareth. Child seemed to have few friends among the other students, and often wandered alone through the quieter sections of the station. Jia remembered being a lonely child herself, always watching from the edges of groups, never quite fitting in. She wanted to speak to Chareth, but knew that any approach would be seen as threatening. The station administrator, Elder Velith, had made the rules absolutely clear during her orientation. Humans were not to interact with Karathi children under any circumstances. Physical contact was forbidden, even prolonged eye contact was discouraged. The Karathi considered their young to be sacred, and the presence of a predator species near them was tolerated only because of practical necessity. Jia respected these boundaries, but she found small ways to reach out that did not violate the letter of the law. She had learned origami as a child, and she began folding small paper figures during her meal breaks. Cranes and frogs and flowers took shape under her fingers. Creatures from a planet the Karathi had never seen. She left them in places where Chareth might find theme. Paper bird balanced on a windowsill near the child's usual wandering path. A tiny folded star tucked into a corner where small eyes might spot it. She never saw Chareth take them, but they always disappeared. Weeks passed, and the small gifts continued. Asia found herself looking forward to creating each new figure, wondering which one might make a lonely child smile. She crafted a paper crane with wings that actually moved when you pulled its tail. and she left it on a bench outside the secondary cafeteria where she had seen Chirith sitting alone the next day. She spotted the child from across a crowded corridor. Chirith held the crane carefully in small taloned hands and made the wings flap up and down with obvious delight. The child looked up and met Jihai's eyes across the distance. For one moment, there was no fear, only gratitude. Then a teacher noticed the exchange and hurried Chirith away while glaring at Jihai with undisguised hostility. Elder Veleth summoned her to his office that afternoon. The administrator was ancient by Karathi standards. His feathers faded to gray and his movements slow and deliberate. Sat behind a desk made from some polished alien wood and studied Jihai with eyes that held centuries of prejudice. "You have been leaving objects for the children," he said in careful comment, his beak clicking between words. "I meant no harm," Jihai replied, keeping her voice soft and her posture submissive. "They are only paper, Elder. Just shapes I fold to pass the time. Your intentions do not matter." Elder Veleth said, "The children are not yours to approach, to gift, to contact in any way. You are here to work and nothing more. Do you understand this?" Jihai bowed her head. "I understand." She returned to her quarters and sat on her narrow bed and looked out at the storms that raged across the gas giant. Below, she would stop leaving the origami figures. She would follow the rules and keep her distance and finish her contract in silence, but she could not stop the ache in her chest when she thought of Chirith, alone and curious and reaching out across the gap between their species, only to have that connection forbidden. The station's warning alarms began to blare. 3 hours later, Jihai jumped to her feet as red lights flashed through her room and an automated voice announced an emergency in calm, measured tones. She grabbed her tools and ran toward the nearest information terminal, where a crowd of panicked Karathi had already gathered. The display showed a nightmare approaching. A massive debris field from a destroyed mining vessel was on collision course with Veleth 9. Thousands of fragments ranging from pebbles to boulders screaming through space toward the station. Impact was estimated in less than 2 hours. The shields could stop the largest pieces, but hundreds of smaller fragments would tear through the hull like needles. Through silk, Jihai watched the Karathi around her erupt into chaos, their musical voices rising in fear and confusion. Somewhere in the educational wings, children were being gathered for evacuation. Somewhere among them was a small child with pale blue feathers who had been brave enough to watch when everyone else ran. The alarms continued to scream as Jihai pushed through the crowd and headed toward her duty station. She did not know yet what the next hours would demand of her. She did not know that everything was about to change.